evening. Hope everyone is well out there. Welcome to tonight's webinar. Path to USMLE Step. My name is Kelly. I am the speaker for tonight. I'm an educator at the University of Louisville, an allergist, section chief there. You know me perhaps better as the senior editor for the first day for the USMLE Step 1, Step 2, Step 3 books. And I'm also the Chief Education Officer for ScholarRx and USMLE-Rx. So welcome. Forward to with you folks tonight. I have with me Jeff and Louise, who will be there to help answer questions as we go along the way. There is a control panel if you're on a laptop or a desktop that you can use to enter questions. Same thing if you are on a phone or an Android device or a tablet. So, we want this to be interactive. It's not just me lecturing to you. So there's questions, we'll do our best to answer them. All righty. So we'll get going. So this is the first word in the book First Aid for the USMLE Step 1. It is relax, and the reason we speak about that is that we want you to keep the long view when you're preparing for the USMLE. This is not a sprint, so you want to kind of take the long view in mind when preparing for this exam. So what are we going to do over the next 45 minutes to an hour is go over the basics. We'll provide the latest USMLE updates. We'll talk about defining goals, timelines for studying, approaching subjects, prep resources, and additional study tips. There is a special raffle and as well as a special offer for those of you that can stick to the very end of the presentation, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. If I missed anything, or if there are themes that are out there that Jeff and Louise are picking up, they'll bubble it up, and we'll have a chance to chat about that. All right, so before we get going too far, I want to learn a little bit about you folks. So I want to know who's out there. We got quite a few people out there tonight, so I'm going to launch this poll, and I want to know what kind of student or graduate are you? So you should be receiving a poll, and then you should be able to start answering the poll. All right, we're getting some responses now. It seems like polling's a little slow tonight. I'm not really sure why, but we'll keep it open for a minute or so. Okay, great. Looks like the majority of folks have answered. So let me share the results so you can see. So there's a good split between US students and international students and graduate. So great to have that mix. The next question I want to ask is, let me pull it up right now, is when do you plan to take the USMLE? So is it really soon, sometime later this year, next year, or you're not sure yet? So let me get that poll out there. So it's going to get to you in a couple of seconds, and then you should be able to provide a response. All right. For whatever reasons, it's taking the sweet time distributing the poll. Oh, it's out there. Okay, good. So hopefully we'll start seeing some responses. Oh, yep, it's coming in. Nice. So we'll keep it open for another 5 to 10 seconds to get a good number of responses. All right, looks like the majority of folks have responded. I'm going to share the results, and it looks like the majority of folks will be taking it, sometime this year. So, but it's kind of an even spread between the spring, the summer, and then this fall. So, looks like all kinds of preparations going on, which is perfectly fine. And I suspect we've got folks from all over the place. I already see people in the question box, sharing where they're from. Folks from Mexico, Haiti, right around the corner, New York, Orlando. So that's great. If you want to pop in the question box where you're from, that's great. I'll try to give you guys a shout out. All right. And then let's get going here. So make sure whoops. Okay, oh, yeah, okay. Wasn't quite sure about the poll. Okay, so, oh yeah, folks are kind of chiming in. Seattle, Atlanta, Buffalo, London, Puerto Rico, a couple of folks from Puerto Rico, Detroit in the house, Atlanta, so India, Republic, so welcome to you all. All right, so USMLE is a one-day exam, as you all know, 8 hours, 280 questions per test, divided in 7 one-hour blocks, 40 questions per block, 45 minutes of break time. So most of you folks are knowing, especially those that are about to take the exam, later this spring or summer. And what you can see here is this is the schematic here, and the blue blocks represent the 7 blocks. This block here is the orientation block. And the key thing to know here is that you're actually given 15 minutes to do this orientation block. But if you go to usmle.org and do the sample exam that's there, you'll see the same orientation block. And so the only reason you need to do this block again is to get in to adjust the volume on your headset. And if you do that, you'll capture most of the 15 minutes that's allotted for that, and then that will go to your break time. So you should be able to start with close to an hour of break time. See, a bunch of folks just registered where they're from: Kenya, Maryland, Puerto Rico, Grenada, Boston, California, Indiana, Turkey, Florida, Canada, Pakistan, St. Vincent's. So folks are in a lot of different places. So again, welcome. Okay, California. All right, so what's on the exam? The exam is single best answer. There are a small number of questions that have multimedia in them. Most of the questions have a clinical vignette in the stem. So the stem is where they set up the case, or they have a scenario. And you'll find that in most of the exam. And the questions often integrate multiple concepts together. So you've heard these as multi-step questions, for example, and they're designed to in combining these concepts. It is similar to how medicine works in real life. It's not that somebody presents with a single problem or a single entity. It's all part of a holistic whole, and so there are multiple concepts, multiple things that work with each other. So, for example, here's a 32-year-old woman who presents with a 5-day history of occasional double vision and bilateral ptosis. So that's in your stem here. And then it goes on to ask, what is the most appropriate diagnostic test? When you pause and think about this, you'll recognize that this is at least a 2-step question, right? Why? Because when you look at the stem, it almost begs to you to ask, well, what's the diagnosis? But that's not what it's asking. It's asking, what's the diagnostic test? But in order to come up with the most appropriate diagnostic test, you have to have a primary diagnosis in mind. So in this case, with this younger woman who has this recent onset of double vision and bilateral, so all symptoms that are around the eyes, it's most likely going to be myasthenia gravis. You could argue for something like multiple sclerosis, but it tends to have more unilateral findings. All right, we got folks coming in from Virginia, South Carolina, Bogota, Texas, but going between there and Guadalajara, Nigeria, multiple folks from Florida, and then Sudan, and then somebody from Michigan. So great spread of folks. Arizona in the house, so that's great. All right, so in this particular case, if the first step is myasthenia gravis, then the most appropriate diagnostic test is going to be, anti-cholinesterase antibodies. So that's the state of the art in the U.S. It used to be hydrophilium, which is a short-acting anti-cholinesterase inhibitor, also known as the tensilum test, but that medication drug is no longer available in the U.S. All right, there you go. See somebody chiming in with tensilum test. All right, we've got folks from New Orleans, Virginia, Antigua. So welcome. All right, so this is the interface here. Most of you are already very familiar with this. Again, if you're taking the exam in the next couple of months, it's pretty standard. What you see at the Prometric Center, you've got the case here, right? So this is the stem. Then the question, which is also known as the lead-in, your responses. So typically there's a minimum of 4 potential responses, but typically you'll see 5, occasionally you'll see 6, rarely you'll see 7. About 15 to 20% of the time, you'll have an image or some diagnostic data that goes along with it. You've got your navigation across the top and the left side. You got your timers at the bottom. You can lock the exam if you need to use the facilities, and you can end the block. Now, couple things to remember. While you are in the block, you can change your response for any of these questions, but as soon as you exit the block, you are locked out. And then, of course, as you can see here, you've got a day timer, a block timer, and then the amount of time remaining during the day. And the other thing to note is that if you exit the block with time remaining in the block, that time goes over into whatever break time you have. All right, so now let's talk about scoring and pass-fail. So as you know, the exam has been passed for the last couple of years now, and passing is currently at about 196. The mean roughly is 231, but that was what was last reported before the exam went pass-fail, with a standard deviation of roughly 19 points. The key challenge here that you can see here is that passing rates have dropped over time. It was as high as 97% in 2020, and then it went to 95, 91%, 90% for allopathic medical students. You see a similar trend with osteopathic students and also with IMGs. And obviously you can tell that in international micrograduate students, unfortunately, it's a little tougher. In terms of the pass rate here. Hopefully that will reverse soon. We'll get the 2024 data sometime later this year, probably in the late summer. So there's a lot of reasons why people think this is happening. A lot of it, I think, at the end of the day, stems from exam going pass-fail, and test takers mistakenly believing that, not that it's any easier, but that they're not going to fail. They were originally trying to get a 250 or 245, but it is still a hard exam. And I think test takers have been lulled into a false sense of security. And if they were marginal to begin with, then they were higher risk for failing. So here's more data, and you can see that it breaks down by degree, by the MD osteopathic, and you can see the pass rates and how it's dropped. You can see that the passing is lower for repeaters. So the challenge is, if you fail, it's harder to pass on the second try. And here's the data for IMGs as well too. So, and again, the pass rate if you fail is pretty rough. Okay, so one thing we need to keep in mind is the USMLE has been used and will continue to be used as a screening tool, particularly now with the Step 2 CK with Step 1 going pass fail. This is the mnemonic, the road to riches, spells out the very competitive specialties that use the USMLE Step 2 CK as a screening tool. So radiology, radiation oncology, orthopedics, ophtho-otolaryngology, urology. So these are the surgical subspecialties. Aesthetics, so plastics, and then dermatology. So just keep these in mind. We're obviously not. This is not about the Step 2 CK, but one thing to keep in mind is that your preparation for the Step 1 will set you up also for success on the Step 2 CK. So that should be another incentive for why you should take the Step 1 seriously, not just the fact that there's a higher risk of failing. The other thing I'll mention about the Step 1, and this is just our own anecdotal experience just at the University of Louisville and what I've heard of the places, is that if you fail, even if you pass the second time, you're already behind. That means you're gonna struggle on your shelf exams potentially. In addition to being at a disadvantage when it comes time to prepare for the Step 2 CK. So the time you invest now in Step 1 will eventually pay off, in your clerkships and on the Step 2 CK as well too. So that's my perspective with limited anecdotal data. All right. So in terms of US line and what's been changed, there's a bunch of text here, but the bottom line is it's all pretty minor. They recategorized a couple of things, they renamed a couple of things, but nothing got moved. There's no change in the weightings of the different topics and whatnot, so you don't have to worry about that. But things might be named a little differently, so people have gotten that's caused some confusion in the past. All right, so study strategies is something that we often think about, and the good news is that you've taken standardized exams before, like MCAT and other exams, and so you generally have a sense of what processes and techniques have worked for you or not. But a couple of things, in addition, is that you should keep in mind the structure and characteristics of a subject. So, for example, certain subjects like microbiology and pharmacology have a regular or kind of a repeatable framework for how the information is organized or how they relate to each other. And so tables, flashcards, can be used, for those topics. Physiology in particular, is more about the relationships among hormones and stuff like that. And so sometimes you have to kind of draw, mind maps or diagrams, to understand them and potentially learn those. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing is, your curriculum. Your curriculum may have different approaches, in terms of what it's trying to do, and that may or may not, benefit you when it comes to the USMLE Step 1. And so, your seniors would have, advice and perspectives on what they experienced in terms of, how well your school curriculum prepares you for the Step 1, in addition to obviously what it has to do to make you hopefully a wonderful doctor. And then lastly, time is obviously, a limiting factor, and you won't have as much time as you want in some cases, in many cases, and you just need to recognize that if it's a small subject like neuroanatomy, you'll only be investing limited time, and so that means you'll be limited to the tactics and what you can do and the strategies that you're going to be applying. Whereas if it's pathology, which is roughly half the USMLE, you'll spend more time there, and you'll have more ways of attacking or approaching that subject area or integrating with other concepts. So that's worth keeping in mind. All right. So in the next 5 to 10 minutes, I'm going to talk about, tips and, advice for each of the major discipline areas. Now, these discipline areas, will cross apply, of course, to organ systems. So when we talk about anatomy, then you can apply it to GI anatomy, respiratory anatomy, and so forth. And there will be a couple of themes that will kind of pop out, as you approach each of these disciplines as we go through. So the first theme is that while this is called a basic science exam, it's actually fairly clinical. And so that means, they're mostly focusing on concepts that have some sort of clinical or real world relevance. Okay, so it could be clinical, and that's what it's going to be most of the time, but it could also be epidemiology, or it could be bench science and whatnot. So all those are fair game. That all falls in the medical science realm, and it's all relevant. Okay, so that means that anatomy about the landmarks around appendicitis, it could be high yield. If you see a patient in the emergency room who has a spiral fracture of the humerus, severed a particular nerve that went through the humeral groove, right? Then you will be able to predict what type of sensory and motor deficits that patient has in their hand because of that nerve injury, right? So those are the types of concepts that will be high yield. Otherwise, gross anatomy is going to be low yield. Neuroanatomy and embryo can be higher yield because of the clinical vignettes scenarios that can be driven off of those concepts. You will see structural anatomy, but it won't be as gross anatomy. It'll be as X-rays, CTs, MRs. Okay, so again, it's something that you would see in real life as a doctor, as a scientist, as a epidemiologist, as a health policy person. All right. Biochemistry is one of the crammable disciplines, and when I mean crammable, there is information that has kind of a regular structure, particularly in this case, metabolic disorders and so forth, because they tend to have regular concepts around regulatory enzymes, the pathways, what are the substrates, what are the results, that type of stuff. They have typical generic errors that go along with these metabolic disorders. Other areas in biochem that are high yield would be vitamin deficiencies, and they're often integrated with other concepts like pathology, pathophysiology. And again, that's the other theme, is that because about half the exam will have multi-step questions or more, that you're integrating all the time. So always think about how you can integrate all the various concepts. It's tougher in the first year of medical school, but as you get into the second year of medical schools, as you go through various disciplines, and particularly as you go into organ systems, organ system blocks, you'll be able to start to see the cross connections between different organ systems and different disciplines. And so try to learn all those connections and how do they apply in health, in disease, in science, in health policy, and so forth. Speaking of bench science, there are lab techniques, or there are basic science investigational techniques that you just need to know, because it's again either relevant in lab medicine, or relevant in science, like flow cytometry, RT-PCR, which is used both in the lab for disease diagnosis and also in bench science. All right, micro and immunology is one of those crammable subject areas. Again, because there's a predictable framework about how a lot of the bugs are organized. Particularly around how they're diagnosed, where they go, the target organs, methods of spread, and the diagnosis, also vectors, reservoirs, and treatments, right? Keep in mind that it's not just about bacteriology. There's all kinds of other things that get tested, including virology, parasitology, fungology, immunology. Speaking of immunology, it's critical to know the immune response both in health and disease. In our post-pandemic era, we know how important vaccines are, and traditionally immunodeficiencies have been highly tested on the exam relative to how they actually show up in real life. Mainly because immunodeficiencies are often genetically driven, and a breakdown a breakdown in one part of the immune response often gives you a window into actually how the immune system works. And so it is a favorite for some clinical vignette questions. All right, as I mentioned earlier, pathology is around half the exam, so there is no getting around this area. You need to have good mastery just for passing. Even before even when the exam was a scored exam. So when thinking of disease presentations, knowing the hallmark characteristics, of course, is critical. But that's obviously for the more uncommon disease. For common conditions, they will also test variations. So, for example, when we think of asthma, we think of wheezing and shortness of breath. But you can often have an asthma presentation where it's just coughing. So it may not just be a kid out there with a little virus or a sinus condition, but it could be cough-bearing asthma. So you can't necessarily exclude asthma just because there's no shortness of breath and wheezing. In the STEM, you may get information with regards to age, gender, ethnicity, and so forth. And when they do that, they may be going after a target population that have a propensity for that condition. So obviously keep that in mind. Could be helpful, but at the same time, it can not be a red herring, because that's too strong a word. But sometimes students over interpret that and look for pathognomonic relationships when there isn't any. So, for example, when we think sarcoidosis, we may be thinking of a younger Black woman, but heck, sarcoidosis can also show up in older men. It just happens to be more common in in younger Black women. But again, that's not a pathognomonic relationship, and there's very few things like that are pathognomonic. So you got to keep the whole history in mind and not just jump straight from Ashkenazi Jew and think, hey, this is sporotrichosis, and or because somebody was in the rose garden, that type of stuff. And speaking of which, you will have while there may be buzzwords in the stems, and eponyms and so forth. Sorry, and you may have when you're studying, you got eponyms and so forth. Those are typically described out in very generic, neutral language in the stems. So obviously, doing USMLE style questions, you can kind of get a sense of what shows up. Then lastly, as I mentioned earlier, about sometimes 10 to 20% of the time you'll run into images and so forth. Just keep in mind that the majority of the time, fortunately, you'll be able to figure out the answer by working through the distractors in the stem, and that the images are helpful for supporting. Key thing about these images. Key things about these images is that don't look at them first. Look at them after you break down and dissect. The lead-in, the stem, and then the distractors. All right. Next, pharmacology, also crammable. And again, scramble because they often, key in on mechanisms and toxicities. So when studying pharmacology, yes to prototypic drugs, yes to the major variants. You don't, unless you're really trying to outperform, minor derivatives tend not to be tested as much. You'll never see trade names and you'll never see dosages. These are the major categories: autonomic, central nervous, antimicrobial, cardiovascular, oncology. There's a couple other minor groups. These are all covered in the various pharmacology sections and in the organ systems and first aid. And again, it's going back to one of those earlier themes. Keep in mind, what are the possible integrations? How does this integrate with biochemistry? How does this integrate with pathology, physiology, and so forth? How can this be applied? I mentioned earlier that physiology is concept oriented. So again, diagrams, mind maps work well. And again, so think about the relationships between the hormones and what happens with the HPA axis and so forth. And clearly, because there's lots of crossover with pathology, you'll almost always see physiology in a case-based scenario. Okay, psychiatry includes a mix of related fields. It does feel a bit of mishmash, but you'll see psychiatry, psychology, sociology, psychopharmacology, often, interacting. We tend to focus on mood disorders, but keep in mind that there are other high-yield disorder groups like personality disorders and so forth. It's again, we touch on all the high-level groups in first aid. And you can often pick up some points there. All right, public health, traditionally has been a mix of biostats, epidemiology, ethics, and healthcare law. More recently, there's been more of a shift to healthcare delivery, patient safety, quality improvement. Collectively, you might have heard the term health system science. That's where a lot of this has been coming from. You might also hear of population health and so forth. So they're all interrelated. As I mentioned, epi and biostats are high yield. It's fairly fixed what they generally test. So you can target you can clearly target where you want to go, and we think the biostats epi section in first aid is relatively complete. Several years ago, they added these doctor-patient interaction questions where it's really kind of a patient communications or family communications type scenario where you're given a scenario with the patient or their family. There's a challenging situation, and then somebody may say something, and then you have to respond, and your response is in the form of a quote, right? So these are these doctor-patient interactions. We also call them quote questions as well too. So just keep in mind, you'll see them, so that you won't be thrown off. Okay, so again, that was a kind of a quick walkthrough what's high yield. And again, don't worry if you didn't catch it all. These slides are available at firstaidteam.com, and as well as a recording of a recent presentation as well too. Let's go on to review resources. So there's all kinds of things that you can use to prepare for the USMLE: text reviews, question banks, videos, digital flashcards, review casts, all kinds of digital apps out there these days. And the challenge is that you don't have all the time in the world, and obviously you don't have all the money in the world either, right? So what do? So first and foremost, you need to check out the resources in first aid for the USMLE Step 1. That's section 4. So flip to the back of your book. And even if you don't have the latest version, you can go to our blog at firstaidteam.com. I think Jeff can drop in a link there where you can access these resources. And it's a community service. You don't have to buy anything. Just go there and get it. And it'll have a rating and a description of those resources. Couple things to keep in mind. Whatever you use, pick it early and use it along with your coursework if possible if you're still in school. Do not overbuy. I know it's super tempting when you feel like you got to get geared up. You want to buy everything, use everything, but that's not possible. So you want to be selective. Everything is available essentially instantly, including books. You can pretty much get books, next day these days. And so, buy it when you need it, but if you need it, go ahead and get it early so that you can use along with your coursework. And then just recognize that there are certain things that certain resources that are applicable for certain subjects and not so much for others, right? So it's not a one size fits all. So do your homework and choose wisely. All right, so let's check in to see how you guys are doing. I want to learn a little bit about what you're going to be using or what you will be using or have been using to prepare for the USMLE Step 1. So I'm sending out a poll, and let me know what you are using. It could be one of the above, all of the above, some of the above, but it's got to be something. So hopefully you should be receiving the poll any second now, and hopefully we'll start getting some responses. Yes, I see some responses coming in. I'll give you guys a few extra seconds to answer because you have to think yes, no for each of these five responses. All right, about half you folks have responded. We'll keep it going for another 5-10 seconds. All right, so looks like most of you have responded. So let me go ahead and close and share. So almost everybody will be using question. No question about that. The majority of you, most of you will also be using review books and videos. Roughly half of you using flashcards, and we're seeing more people using AI in their test prep as well too. So not a surprise there. Oops, sorry, I don't think I shared the results here, but you can just see what I just reported out. All right, so what are some general approaches when in preparing for the exam? One is you want to think about developing a study schedule. Be thoughtful about it. Check with your classmate, check with the student success people at your school. But once you put that schedule together, you should be able to stick with it. Now there's a couple other things that you want to do along with that makes this a solid defensible schedule. One is you want to make sure that you give yourself time for breaks, for exercise. Particularly in the dedicated period, you should at least still take one day off, a week, just to decompress, be a human being, be with others, and so forth. You want to make sure that your crammable subjects, those things that I just talked about, like biochemistry, pharmacology, microbiology, are put more toward the end. Now, let me make it clear: you should not cram. Cramming is not a viable approach for approaching an exam that's covering 2 years of medical education, right? But that being said, when you get into the last week or so, or 1 to 2 weeks, there may be a couple of those crammable subjects you can put there, and you might be able to get across the finish line on a little bit of short-term memory. The other thing to keep in mind, as I mentioned, is you need to integrate and apply everything, and make sure that everything that you're learning, focus on what has some sort of clinical relevance, or bench science relevance, or health policy relevance. With regards to your curriculum and what you've done, focus on what is high yield, per books like First Aid and other resources. So you've seen it. If you've seen it before, then it's going to be easier to relearn. As I mentioned, make sure you take time to be a human being. You want to stay relaxed and grounded. And we do have a checklist that's near the beginning of the book that can help you with organizing what to do in the months and weeks and days ahead of the actual exam. And for the exam as a computer-based test, CB, as I mentioned, there's that tutorial that you want to be familiar with, and you do that, you'll be able to capture 15 minutes extra for break time. There are some keyboard shortcuts. I know most people don't use it, but just in case, you can use that in addition to a mouse. And then, of course, because it is about testing, I think we all know that you want to mix Q&A throughout, your entire preparation. And there's core science that supports this, in the journal Science and in many other publications. It's well known that you can learn through self-testing. And it actually even made the front page of the science section of the New York Times. So where they showed that students who studied by self-testing, that's called retrieval practice, did much better versus other study techniques, even controlling for time, right? Everybody was given the same amount of time, but self-testing does better, even if they are more complex inferential questions. Okay, computerized testing options. Let's talk about that for a minute. So there are a number of choices. And they have different purposes, we think. One is the USMLE sample test, better known as the free 120. It's helpful for format familiarity. They refresh it every once in a while, and so there's a mix of items that are more up to date, and then there's a couple that are a little, unfortunately, long in the tooth. There's also the NB-CBSSA. CBSSA stands for Comprehensive Basic Science Self-Assessment. There's always 4 to 6 forms of this. They retire them and they turn them over, relatively frequently. These are, you can buy them for $40 to $60, and they usually have 4 blocks, and they're helpful for benchmarking. So when you do them, you'll get a histogram breakdown, and then you'll get a probability of passing, and how that translates to the USMLE. And then there are Q banks, such as USMLE-Rx, UWorld, and so forth. And so these are obviously good for practice and studying, and it's also good for simulation. So for example, in USMLE-Rx, not only do we have the self-assessments like most people do, but you can actually go into the core question bank and create an all-day simulation if you really want to see how you do, in a full day live fire, simulation. And then we can predict your probability passing as well too. All right, so let's talk about evidence-based study techniques. As I mentioned earlier, you've taken standardized exams before, so you generally know what works well for you. But this is additional evidence-based for specific preparation techniques. So question banks versus flashcards. Question banks are going to be more effective than flashcards. I think most people, understand that. Q banks are structured much more like the real thing. Flashcards tend to be more recall, whereas question banks tend to be more applications, which is actually what the boards is testing. Obviously, you need some of the basic questions, so this might be helpful for foundational, but at the end of the day, you're going to drive better results, pound for pound through Q banks. The other thing is that there have been multiple studies looking at, how many questions that it takes to do to get 1 extra point in the boards. Now, again, I know you don't have scores anymore, but it is worth remembering that you do have to do a fair number of questions, a couple hundred questions, to get an extra point, controlling for GPA and MCAT. There's been at least one study that looked at how many questions you should do, and this came out of the University of Michigan, and what they found is that students doing more than 3,000 questions did the best. Now, they kind of that was the top tier. They didn't stratify and say, hey, look, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000. We do think that the evidence supports, or that we've seen from other studies, is that the more questions you do, the better. But you will flatten out at some point. It could be 4,000, it could be 5,000 questions. But at least you need to be doing several thousand questions. And by the way, it's unique questions. So it's popular for people to do question banks over the same question bank over and over again. Now it's okay to, I think, to redo certain questions where you're struggling on the subject area and you want to go through the explanations because you can learn from that. But in terms of the true retrieval practice effect, it's best if it's unique MCQs versus repeat MCQs. So in fact, the study that looked at the number of questions found that the impact was only with unique MCQs. So, and if they did repeat MCQs, it didn't actually help them any further. And then lastly, first aid has been proven to be helpful. So I had no relationship to that study, but students that did 3 passes or more did better on their USMLE. That being said, the caveat, I think, is that it needs to be active learning. Just highlighting your first aid is not going to help you. Highlighting is just passive learning. Watching a video is just passive learning. You have to apply what you see. So that means using building flashcards out of first aid, or using our flash facts in USMLE-Rx, which teaches you all the key content of first aid, can help you actively apply that information and therefore make it stick. All right, so hopefully that review of the research was helpful. Let's talk about test day tips. So, a couple of things to keep in mind. You're going to be pretty jacked up that day, so be careful about how much coffee you take. You may not even need any. You're going to be in a air-conditioned building. It tends to be chilly throughout the world with these prometric testing centers. They have these fairly uniform testing conditions. But so come in with layered clothing, and so you stay comfortable, and you can you can adjust as necessary depending on how cold or warm it gets, if it gets warm. The stems may be of moderate to very long. So if you run into a large case, or a large case that has a lot of information, for sure you want to read the lead-in first, then look at the distractors and work your way in. We do have a separate series of webinars called question dissection webinars, and Jeff can drop in a link there for you to check out. And we go through a 7-step process for breaking down these questions. That's obviously not the only way to do it, but it is a very reproducible way. But regardless of whatever methodology you use, going after the lead-in first, particularly if it's a long, complicated-looking question, will give you the big picture. In terms of managing the clock, just to remind you, you have 40 questions to do in a 60-minute block. That means you have 90 seconds per question. I strongly advise that you commit to an answer within 60 seconds of start reading that question. So that way, if you do that, you'll have or a little more. You can go up to 70 seconds, but that means that'll save you. That'll give you anywhere between 10 to 20 minutes left over at the end of the block, to go back and look over questions where that may be solvable. You didn't quite nail it. You were able to narrow it down to 2 options, maybe 3 options. And so you can come back and try to work through those. A couple of things there to keep in mind. If even if you committed an answer, if you think you can solve it, it's okay to change your answer if you have a good rationale. People say the the time-honored advice is never second guess yourself, but the data actually doesn't support that. Not for the USMLE, not for the SAT, not for other standardized exams. And so if you can reason out a better answer, you should go with it, even if it means changing your answer. And the data supports that. It's not a huge difference, but it may be enough. And if you want to, like in USMLE-Rx and so forth, we can track the number of times you change from right to wrong and wrong to right. In terms of breaks and so forth, as I mentioned, you've got, you should have close to an hour of break time more if you can finish your blocks early. A lot of folks will go a couple blocks, take a break, light snack, couple blocks, light snack. The other way is to go 3 blocks. I'm a big believer in taking a couple of breaks so you can stretch, reset your mind, that type of stuff. But again, at the end of the day, you do you. And one way you can figure that out is, do a full day simulation in USMLE-Rx, by creating a full day exam there. Just remember, if you want to do a full day simulation, you want to go in and block off those questions early, so it'll reserve them out of your question out of your question bank. Okay, lastly, we've got the C reflex, which was a joke, kind of an inside joke, in our study group in med school. So the idea is and the realization is that you're not going to know the answer to all the questions, and there'll be some questions where just you look at it and you're like, I clearly don't know what's going on here. Either I didn't learn it, or it wasn't, or I didn't remember it. That's fine. If you don't know if the question is not solvable at all, within 60 to 70 seconds, your go-to answer and move on. As a matter of fact, if you can figure out that question is not solvable earlier, then you can save that time for another question that's more solvable, right? So that in itself is a skill, right? Being able to realize when you're not going to be able to solve it, so you don't just keep wasting time on that question.